So some breaking news coming in the last couple of minutes on social media. It's a story that is just exploding all over WWE social media and WWE.com, and that is current WWE Champion Drew McIntyre has tested positive for COVID-19 and has been placed in quarantine. WWE were first to break this story, first to announce this story on their social media platforms. They said, quote, Drew McIntyre has tested positive for COVID-19 and has been placed in quarantine. Check back to WWE.com for more updates as they become available, end quote. So certainly is something that I don't think anyone saw coming. It certainly is something that I don't think anyone saw that this was going to happen. How could you? We are in a pandemic though, I suppose, and these things are inevitably going to happen despite the best practices that WWE have in place right now. Now, WrestleVotes Online, this is WrestleVotes, a reputable Twitter account. They've just tweeted out the following as well. So, I mean, apologise if I'm a bit scatterbrained here right now because everything is just kind of exploding over the last couple of minutes or so. They have tweeted out, and they're very, very reputable as well, so I lean into believing this case. They said, quote, source, with Drew McIntyre out, WWE is keeping Randy Orton in tonight's main event and are working on finding a suitable replacement to match up against the College Football Championship game, end quote. Now, who would that be? Of course, there's a big list of people who it could be. I would probably think it would most likely be Keith Lee that will face Randy Orton, because obviously we actually did a preview that was going to go up later tonight prior to Monday Night Raw. Now that's all going to change, but previously we had done a preview that Randy Orton was going to be facing Drew McIntyre tonight on Monday Night Raw. That was the announced main event. That was the announced main event for tonight's show. It had been advertised since Friday night's edition of SmackDown. Actually today, WWE's PR Twitter account, WWE's public relations Twitter account actually came out and said that that was going to be for the WWE Championship. Now I think that was probably a mistake. Nevertheless, that main event is off. Drew McIntyre is now in quarantine. Obviously, first of all, before we get into any of the what's going to happen next, first of all, we hope Drew McIntyre obviously has a speedy recovery, and hopefully he has a typical recovery. Hopefully he doesn't have any major symptoms. Hopefully he's feeling fine. Hopefully there is nothing complicated about his experience with the current virus in this pandemic right now. Hopefully it's just a case of McIntyre quarantining for 2 weeks, and hopefully he'll be back then. When you do think about that, obviously when you talk about the quarantine, the next question will be, will he be back in time for the Royal Rumble? Well, the Royal Rumble is on January 31. Today, as of right now, it's Monday, January 11. So if he does quarantine for 14 days, then that means he'll be back, say, the 25th of January. So he might be back for the go-home edition of Monday Night Raw before the Royal Rumble, and therefore he still, at this period of time, is advertised to compete at the Royal Rumble, to defend his WWE Championship at the Royal Rumble. And given, and hopefully, fingers crossed, if his recovery is typical and it's not atypical in any way, hopefully, if it's just a case of he doesn't have any symptoms, but he's just tested positive and he has to quarantine for 2 weeks, hopefully he'll be back for the go-home edition of Monday Night Raw, and hopefully he'll also be back for the Royal Rumble. I would assume that would probably be the case. And I would hope, fingers crossed, touch wood, that Drew McIntyre does recover quickly, and most importantly, there are no side effects or anything, complications or anything of that nature. So let's hope that he's back for the go-home edition of Monday Night Raw, and let's hope that he's also back for the Royal Rumble in the end of the month, which I think he will be. Of course, he is scheduled at this point in time to defend the WWE Championship against Goldberg. We were going to get some more information about that tonight on Monday Night Raw. Now that's no longer the case because, of course, McIntyre will not be on Monday Night Raw tonight. But ultimately, I suppose the thing you do have to think about with these kind of situations, there are lots of things scattering around my brain right now when I try and process this news about McIntyre testing positive. I think one thing that does come into my mind, and I've seen some parts of it on social media as I just sort of read it right now, we are having some reports of people saying that there might possibly be a situation where there's a new outbreak within the WWE about this COVID-19. Sean Ross Sapp from Fightful is reporting that there is a COVID outbreak that will probably affect most televised brands this week. This is on their Patreon service, so be sure to check that out. But as always, whenever we have these people testing positive, we know that lots of WWE superstars live in close quarters to each other. Some actually share houses together. Some ride together in Florida to the various WWE shows. So possibly we could be seeing another outbreak. But this is why the testing policy is in place. This is why these testing procedures are in place, because You need to catch this. Now, if WWE in the past, WWE back in June, and once this pandemic first started back in March, April, WWE didn't have really any testing policies in place until June, until July of last year, when it was just out of control. They didn't have any testing policies in place. They didn't have any mask wearing mandates. They just had checking people's temperatures, filling out questionnaires, no social distancing, nothing of that nature, and they were crowded into that WWE Performance Center, and we saw how well that lasted for them. It didn't last very well for them at all, because we had numerous outbreaks. We had people like Roman Reigns, like Kevin Owens, like Sami Zayn, and others refuse to work during the pandemic because they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel that WWE was doing everything they could to stop the spread of the virus, to stop and have their talents and superstars feel safe during this pandemic. Now, regardless of all the practices that WWE can and does put in place when it comes to the pandemic, these things are still going to happen. Why are they still going to happen? Because ultimately you're producing television, a live television wrestling show every single week during a pandemic. You can try to avoid the virus, you can try and do all the things that you should do, whether it's testing, whether it's socially distancing, whether it's hand sanitizing, whether it's mask mandate wearing, which they do, all of that, but ultimately you're still performing and you're still creating a television show during the pandemic. Therefore, you are going to get positive cases. You can do everything to stop it, but unfortunately this is going to be part of the problem. So ultimately, what have we got coming out of this? We've got a lot of confusion and a lot of second guessing now about what's going to happen. Drew McIntyre, when you're face of your brand of Monday Night Raw, when the face of one of the faces of the company of WWE gets test positive, it's not great. But ultimately, let's hope, most importantly, that McIntyre has a speedy recovery. Let's hope that he doesn't have any complications or anything like that. Let's hope that he's just quarantining for 2 weeks. Let's hope he doesn't have any symptoms. Let's hope he can get back to doing what he loves. Let's hope he can get back to being in the ring and performing as soon as possible, as soon as safe and possible. That's the most important thing. Obviously, I know people are now going to worry and have concerns, as I mentioned, about the Royal Rumble at the end of the month and about going on to WrestleMania or anything like that. I would hope, if McIntyre is like a lot of the other cases that we've seen in WWE when they have tested positive or even been exposed to people that have tested positive, I would hope that we see a scenario where McIntyre quarantines for 2 weeks. Because of this, we then see him on the go-home edition of Monday Night Raw on the 25th of January, and then also we will see him at the Royal Rumble defend his WWE Championship against Goldberg on January the 31st. I still think that would probably be the plan. That's assuming that everything goes normal with his recovery, and fingers crossed, as I mentioned, we wish him absolutely all the best. We wish him everything and the best to recover as quickly as possible, as safely as possible, and that he doesn't have any complications from this. But as of right now, he's going to be quarantining for 2 weeks. I'm sure we'll get more details about this because this is a breaking story, and when we do get more details, we'll talk about it here on the channel. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, right now, he has tested positive. That's, if anything, it's a good thing that they've caught it now. That's why the testing procedures are in place. That's why all of this is in place. I would assume, knowing WWE's testing policy as well, talent does get tested the day before the TV tapings, and then they're informed of this on the morning of the taping. So what is it right now? It's about half two in the afternoon, 2:30 p.m. on the East Coast. So they would probably be getting their test back actually a couple of hours ago, or in the morning, frankly. That's how the testing policy works. So it's interesting that WWE have gone public with this, because sometimes they don't. A lot of the times when it comes to these positive tests, they don't go public because they shouldn't. They shouldn't have to. Like we've said about not lots of other cases recently, it's not, as a fan and as a community, it's not our business to know anyone else's personal medical records or anything of that nature. So it's interesting that WWE have decided to go public with this. I'm sure that Drew McIntyre has given this announcement his blessing. If he didn't want to go public with it, it wouldn't be public right now, because ultimately it's Drew McIntyre's health and it's Drew McIntyre's medical condition and its medical record. Now, I would assume WWE would probably look at it as, look, it's the WWE Champion. If the WWE Champion isn't going to be on TV for a couple of weeks, people are going to ask questions. But regardless, whenever we've seen cases where people have tested positive over the course of the last 12 months, WWE just writes them off of TV. They don't show up to TV, and WWE, frankly, doesn't even address the elephant in the room when it comes to that. WWE really doesn't say anything when it comes to a lot of people's positive test results. Why? Because it's none of our business. So it certainly is curious. It certainly is curious that they've announced it when it comes to Drew McIntyre. I would suppose, as I mentioned, one, McIntyre would have signed off on it, and two, it would be because he's the WWE Champion at the end of the day. He's a featured player. He's one of the faces of the WWE, and of course he's in a featured program when it comes to Goldberg at the Royal Rumble. So that's probably the situation when it comes to Drew McIntyre right there. As I mentioned, what happens now? Well, he'll quarantine for 2 weeks. He should be back for the go-home edition of Raw, and he obviously should and hopefully will be back for the Royal Rumble match against Goldberg for the WWE Championship at the end of the month. But most importantly, let's recap. WWE Champion Drew McIntyre has tested positive for COVID-19 and is now quarantining for the next 2 weeks. Fingers crossed, hopefully, McIntyre will be back soon, as long as it's safe to do so. We wish Drew McIntyre nothing but the best in a very quick recovery, and fingers crossed he doesn't experience any symptoms or any side effects or anything like that. Fingers crossed, well wishes to him and his whole family, and hopefully he'll be back soon. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.